So, hello and welcome to the 2025 AEM Summer Outlook. Our talented panel has a combined nearly 75 years of professional experience, beginning with James Amon. James is a senior meteorologist at AEM. He's been with AEM Earth Networks since 1995, providing worldwide forecast and managing weather data quality processes. Prior to that, he was an industrial meteorologist and a weather observer for international airports, including St. Louis and Washington, D.C. Next, Mark Paquette has been with AEM Earth Networks since 2023. Prior to that, he worked at AccuWeather and began his own consulting firm, intersecting weather and legalized sports betting / daily fantasy sports. Last but not least, Kyle Leahy. He's a forecast meteorologist at AEM's WeatherWorks brand. He helps lead the long-range team and assists in operations and managing, guiding and developing our younger meteorologists. As far as the agenda, we're going to begin with drought. I think I've said enough, so at this point, I'll turn it over to James. James, the floor is yours. Let's start things out with drought.
Here's the drought map for Canada. You can see that, again, just like the US, kind of a split screen scenario. Much of eastern Canada is in pretty good shape, has plentiful moisture, a few small areas of abnormally dry. But you go into western Canada, moderate to severe drought across northeastern British Columbia, up into the southwest part of the Northwest Territories, up towards Yellowknife there. Also, moderate drought has developed in central Saskatchewan. There are several large fires in that area, already causing evacuations and some smoke issues in that area. And there's also increasing areas of abnormally dry weather. In terms of the forecast for the drought as we go through the next few months here up in Canada, you can see that in the Northwest Territories, some of that drought could be removed there. That's that sort of dark green shading. But on the flip side, that those other colors, the red and brown colors there in the northeast part of British Columbia, indicates the drought's going to persist or even get worse in some of those areas. And also we're going to see increasing drought development across southern Manitoba into the west end of Ontario there. And the drought is going to persist or maybe even worsen as well in central parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan. So the western part of Canada is going to see a number of areas where the drought is going to persist or get worse as we go through the next several months.
Thank you very much, James. That was awesome. Yep, we're going to talk about wildfires. All right, let's look at what's going on in Canada and try to get an idea where that wildfire smoke is going to go. As James talked about, again, the Canada is very similar to the US in terms of soil moisture and fire danger right now. Out west, and I'm just going to say Western Canada to try to save time, there are lots of issues, a lot of dry conditions, extremely dry conditions. We already see large wildfire burning, and we have a lot of smoke plumes from that already occurring. To the east, no problems basically whatsoever. As we go through the summer, that pattern continues. Up top is June, down the bottom is July. We see that Western Canada does see a little bit of relief. The question is going to be, is it enough? Is it going to be enough relief for the firefighters and the wildfires in general to try to bring them down under control a little bit? And we'll try to answer that. Again, later in the summer, August, September, Western Canada still really sticks out like a sore thumb. So to answer that last question, not too much in the way of relief in terms of wildfires for the people battling out there. Not going to be a lot of widespread soaking rain this summer for Western Canada. And this is currently what's going on. We can see, as James talked about, the wildfires that are going on in Western Canada. There's quite a few of them. And then in the yellow color is basically where that smoke is going to be delivered. Kyle's going to talk about a ridge in the west. What happens when you have a ridge in the west? The air flows around it, and it goes around on the backside of it. It comes from northwest to southeast, and that smoke is going to be directed towards the Great Lakes, the northeast, the northern Appalachians. So that's going to be a thing that we're going to be battling all summer long. Anytime we have a northwest flow pattern, the smoke is going to become an issue. Hopefully it stays high in the sky and isn't really a huge air quality issue, but if the smoke becomes thick enough and prevalent enough, as we saw in the summer of 2023, the smoke can get into the lower layers of the atmosphere and cause some issues with visibility or people who have asthma and stuff like that, lung issues. So basically that's it for me, and I'm going to hand you over to Kyle.
Now that we've gone over stuff like drought and wildfires. Now we are going to talk about just the temperature and precip that we're going to be looking at that is likely going to exacerbate some of those issues in parts of the country, especially the West. So in terms of the outlook factors, what we mainly look at are sea surface temperatures, which kind of play into ENSO, so El Nino and La Nina. Then we'll also look at different analogs, so years that are similar to this one. And then we'll also look at some climate models, some that we have, some that Canada have, and then also just what the CPC is thinking, or just NOAA. So in terms of sea surface temperature anomalies, we are still in the negative phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, so I'll explain. A negative phase is pretty much when you have warmer waters near Japan, so in the western portion of this picture here, and then cooler waters off the west coast, which you can also see. Now, given climate change, what often happens and what's been happening over the last few years is you just go from very warm water near Japan to just less warm water near the west coast, which is the case here. There isn't a really well-formed dipole where you have very warm water and very cool water in like the Gulf of Alaska, but regardless, it's still negative. So that's basically just a continuation of the pattern that we've been seeing for quite a while now. I would say since probably 2021. So in terms of ENSO, so La Nina and El Nino, if you look near the equator, so stretching from near the northern South American coast all the way to north of Australia, there's not really that much of a signal. So we've pretty much reached a neutral phase. So suffice it to say, there isn't really that much of an impact from ENSO this summer. I think that we're still going to be dealing with some residual La Nina impacts. So again, a lot of what we've been seeing, I'll show the temperatures, not really that much of a change. And then in terms of the Atlantic, which doesn't have too much of an impact for summer other than tropical stuff, which we're not going to get into explicitly, but we still are seeing a warm Atlantic, warm Caribbean, warm Gulf. So all else being equal, you're likely going to see a slightly more active season. In terms of the forecast, so what we'll be looking at for the rest of the summer, if we toggle back, there really isn't that much of a change. So you still have those warm waters near Japan, slightly cooler waters near the west coast with perhaps near normal, if not slightly below normal off the coast of California. So that negative PDO feature is still remaining the same. And it does look like we might see a very weak La Nina, or what's known as a cold neutral ENSO develop, where you technically have below normal sea surface temperatures, but they're not cold enough, so they have to be below half a degree Celsius, stretching from 180 all the way to 150 west. So what's known as Nino 3.4, that region in the Pacific. So we're likely going to be looking at cold neutral conditions in the Pacific. So overall, not really all that much of a change from what we're seeing now. We're not expecting any large scale changes to sea surface temperatures. And if we look at some forecast projections, so this is basically just a conglomerate of basically every single model that does predict this stuff. You have some dynamical models, which are closer to the models that meteorologists use to predict the weather on the day by day, week by week basis, and then some statistical models. Overall, though, same kind of deal here. We're likely going to be looking at, by the time we get towards July, August, September, slightly cooler than normal. There's a low chance of a warm neutral or even a weak La Nina, but I would say generally status quo. We're not really expecting that much to change, even by the time we get into winter. Once we get to precip for Canada, it's largely the same. So that general ridge of high pressure, which Mark was talking about, and I'll get to a little bit more, you're largely going to be dealing with continued drier weather over much of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, so just Western Canada in general. And this will also exacerbate wildfires. So pretty much a continuation of what's happening. In terms of any above average precip, if it was going to be anywhere, it'd be into the northern provinces. But for anywhere particularly populated, it's likely going to just be drier than normal. By the time you get towards like Toronto, Ontario, Quebec, it's probably just going to be changeable. If anything, maybe slightly drier. So I don't think that there's going to be too much in the way of significant relief from any sort of wildfires up there. Then once you get to temperature, I feel like this has been the case for years now, where we just have a warm west and a slightly less warm east with not much in the way of cooler weather. Most of Canada is just going to be warm. A lot of the time, by the way, if we look at these seasonal models, anytime you deal with long temporal spans, so months at a time, especially given climate change and whatnot, it's very rare that you're going to see, especially in the summer. It does happen in the winter, but it's very rare that you're going to see a lot of below normal. A lot of these plots are just going to be near normal or above normal. That's just the way it is. So really what you have to look for are areas where the percentage is higher. So those areas would be like British Columbia, Western Canada. You can see it stretched into places like Washington and Idaho. And then a little bit of relief by the time we head into central Canada, and then the signal increases once we head into eastern Canada. So central Canada still looks hot. I definitely wouldn't say that we're looking at a cool summer just because the odds are lower for more persistent heat, but definitely a bit more changeable, it seems. And then once we head into eastern Canada, places like Ontario and Quebec, definitely looks warm. And then I'm pretty much done here, so I will turn it over to Rob.
And without further ado, let's open the floor to Q&A and let's see what we have here lined up. So the first one that I think maybe a lot of us have on our minds has to do with the wildfire smoke. This person asks, how will the Canadian wildfire smoke impact where I live in the Northeast, particularly around the New York City area? Mark, I think that's probably a question for you, right?
Yeah, and as Kyle and I both stressed on that, the conditions in Canada, Western Canada, really aren't going to improve in terms of rainfall. So the wildfires should continue basically unabated. And B, Kyle talked about the ridge as well, which that's going to continue to cause west-northwest flow into much of the eastern half of the country. So smoke issues will become a problem. Now, the question is it going to be high in the atmosphere and all it's going to cause is some visibility issues, or will it get thick enough and low enough to cause some issues with breathing or people that have problems with moderate to dangerous air quality? That's more difficult to determine. It really would take persistent northwest flow for days or even a week in an end to really cause that really poor air quality to move into places like New York City or Chicago. But that is certainly a concern.
Yeah, and it's a good point because it's very easy to look up and see a hazy, smoky sky, or just hear on the news, hey, it's going to be smoky out there. But there's a big difference between having smoke in the sky, which really isn't that impactful, versus being at ground level, which does have those breathing concerns. And that's where having a forecast service or some monitoring through AEM or other vendors, it's really important. So make sure you differentiate that. Is it smoky skies or is it smoky near the ground before you make decisions based off of air quality and your sensitivity? Awesome. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Next question. Are there any periods this summer that pose a notable risk for heat or drought? Kyle, that kind of sounds like what you're just talking about. So you said everywhere looks hot for the most part, but I don't know, are there any particular times, let's say late June or part of July or August, where you're particularly keying in on things?
Yeah. So when I was showing the temp and precip, it was really stretched over a 3-month time frame. So I guess it is useful to talk about a smaller time frame than that. As James was talking about, we are expected to see that big ridge of high pressure in the west sort of build by the time we get late into the month and especially into early July and mid-July. So I would say overall, the biggest signal for any like notable heat for much of the US is probably going to be in July, and that'll be for western portions of the country. And along with that heat, this is also going to get quite dry. So I would expect the worst heat and drought to really be in parts of the Rockies, northern Great Plains, upper Midwest for most of July. And by the time we head into August, what normally happens is you end up getting that heat pushed eastward, although not as severe as the heat in the West, which could be quite persistent. Like I could see a heat wave or two very easily, and that'll also stretch into Western Canada as well.
Another question that kind of had to do with smoke, an observation from this user. I've noticed that it tends to lower max temperatures, but has little effect on min temperatures. Do you think that this will lead to some cooling signal towards the southeast? And Mark, you could probably answer this real quick. Yes, in general, smoke will inhibit some of the sun's rays. Thus, it has a net cooling effect, particularly with high temperatures. If anything, it might actually raise low temperatures. But overall, smoky skies, especially the thicker it is, does have a net cooling effect. But Mark, do you think there's anything notable with that, particularly for the Southeast in this question, or is it minor and transient through the course of the summer?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head here. You can think of smoke as almost like a high cloud layer that sort of filters out the sun a little bit, where during the day it does somewhat limit the high temperatures, maybe by a degree or two, but maybe the more noticeable part is at night is it will blanket in a little bit of the heat that's trying to escape, so make the nights a little bit warmer as well. But yeah, I think as James talked about with the persistent northwest flow in New England, I don't know if we're ever going to get a days on end type of northwest flow into the southeast, say Atlanta or something like that. So it may not just be a transient type of thing down there. For New England, it's more of an issue.
Sure, cool. On this train with drought and kind of wildfire, maybe one of you can answer this. Western Canada, how would this drought compare to 2021? Anybody have insights into that?
I thought he was going to say, he or she was going to say 2023. 2021, I don't have off the top of my head.
Yeah, 2023 in terms of wildfires. I think this is more in terms of the drought that happened in 2021, which definitely had agricultural impacts and all of that. But yeah, just anybody have an idea how this compares, or if not, it's certainly something we can get back to.
The only comment I'll make is that the drought areas in Canada are not as large or as widespread as they are in the U.S. I don't have the information to compare to 2021, but I can say that the drought areas are currently, like in British Columbia, most of the drought is in the northeast and north central or central north parts of British Columbia. It does not cover the entire province. On the prairie provinces, the drought is perhaps a little more widespread, but it's not quite as deep. And again, it's still confined to only maybe 25-30% of each one of those provinces. So it's perhaps not as widespread as it was in 2021. But again, I don't have those figures right in front of me.
Okay.
I also think you can see that it's not so much in the southern part of those, Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and I think that's more the agricultural area. So maybe that could be a little bit of a blessing.
In terms of 2021, it was an analogous year for us. Like, it was in the data set that we used to construct some of the precipitation and temp anomalies. And 2021 itself was like pretty similar in terms of the general distribution, considering it was a super wet year for the East too. Overall, it's pretty close. So I would say up in Canada, it might not be quite as severe, but I would say generally should still be a pretty rough drought year up there.
I suppose the fact that you have to ask that question isn't a good thing, right? Awesome. All right. I just want to wrap things up. I think it's time to bring our webinar to a close. I would like to once again thank our speakers who took time out of their busy day to share this fantastic information, and really enjoyed the Q&A that everyone had. If you have any remaining questions, like I just said, reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to assist you.